to have the Suffolk County Executive Ed Romaine come on up to introduce our keynote speakers.
Thank you. We're going to talk about some of our keynote speakers, and Carolyn Gusoff, who worked for Roosevelt for many years, now CPS, and Katie Beers. I think many of us, turn it on. Okay. Thank you. I didn't know it was off. Well, we're very excited to have Carolyn Gusoff from CBS News, formerly News 12, and Katie Beers, who I think we all know the Katie Beers story for anyone that has followed Child Protective Services from 1992 when she was taken and put in really a cellar, a dungeon. And they're going to be our keynote speakers. And they're both authors of a book called Buried Memories. And Carolyn worked with Katie to write this book and talk what happens when the system doesn't always respond the way we would like it to respond. It turned out to be a good story at the end because she was rescued. She got a foster family that raised her, and she's here today to talk about her story, a story of survival and recovery from child abuse. It's an inspiration. And you know what? The one thing I've learned over many years is you can talk, and I see every day policy papers, I'm sure, our health commissioner, our social service commissioner, others, they see all these policy papers and information and statistics. Nothing tells a story like a personal situation that makes us understand the impact that sometimes government regulations or government action or inaction have. So I'm very pleased that Katie Beers has agreed to speak. I'm very glad that her co-author on Buried Memories have, and I'd asked them to come out on stage, and by the way, they signed the book.
Nice to see you, Ed.
Katie.
Yeah. Can you turn this off? Yes, you can turn that off. I agree. I applaud you. Okay. Thank you. Oh, I turned your mic off.
Yep. We're going to turn it over to these ladies that are going to tell us a personal story of survival and recovery and how it worked out. But before I did, we had a couple other challenge coins made up. One is for Carolyn.
Thank you.
Co-author. The other is for Katie.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Jennifer. And Jennifer and the people that helped organize this. Where is Sylvia? Sylvia, come on up here. And Kristen McKay. Kristen, where are you? I will leave you with this thought. It's easy to be county executive when you have workers like this standing behind you. And I will leave you with one other thought. Together, all of us, share it, working together. Let's see if we can build a better system to protect our children. God bless you. Thank you for what you do. And I'm going to turn it over to these co-authors that are going to talk about buried memories and make us think long and hard how we can build a better system that will serve everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Good. I am in Gulp, my 40th year as a television news reporter. And as such, people always ask me, what's your favorite story? What's your best news story you've ever covered? Well, it seems like a simple enough question, right? But that always stumps me. To me, it's like asking a prosecutor, what's your favorite crime? or a first responder, what's your favorite disaster? It's kind of hard to say. But I actually do cover good news. I cover great news. Inspirational, strong, resilient people who make a difference in our world and in our communities. Okay, just last month, I covered the teacher who saved a sixth grader's life with the Heimlich maneuver, and then taught the class how they could save lives also by learning certain skills. Then there was the all-girls Eagle Scout group. They are bravely breaking barriers and helping a whole lot of people in the process. And then actually the most popular story I've had in a very long time, 1.5 million views on my social media, the neglected turtle that grew a beak like a duck and was sent to the turtle rescue of the Hamptons, where he is now living his best life with volunteers who filed down the beak and are rehabbing him because life, even wildlife, is precious. So every month, every day, I seek out and share positive news, and there is an abundance of it if you just look for the good around us. But, as you know, I also cover plenty of bad news. A lot of heartbreaking tragedy. If my photographer and I are knocking on your door uninvited, it is probably not a good thing. I covered the best and the worst of life, two ends of the spectrum of this ongoing drama of humanity. And I do truly hope that by sharing these often tragic stories, we can all live and learn and aspire to do better. So the story of Katie Beers turns out to be both of these, the worst and the best of human nature. It didn't start out that way. It began on December 29th, 1992, with all the makings of a tragedy. I showed up at work at 7 o'clock in the morning and I was handed a fax from the Suffolk Police Department that said, "Unusual incident." It turned out to be the understatement of the year. A child, 9-year-old Katie Beers, was missing from a game arcade under circumstances evincing an abduction, it said. So that was the start of a mystery that would consume the next days, weeks, and months of my career. It became one of the most compelling sagas in New York criminal history, and it would become a national obsession as details would emerge daily of Katie's shockingly abusive pre-kidnapping life. As I knocked on doors and spoke with her seemingly devastated godmother and oddly absent biological mother, I learned there was also a grown man who would spend time, a lot of time with Katie, Big John he was called, and that he was with Katie last, police said. He had taken her to a game arcade in Nesconset, he told police, for her birthday, and he claimed that she just vanished from the arcade, that he picked up his head and she was just not there anymore. I also learned that Big John would spend a lot of time around children, mostly boys. A single man in his 40s, his house was like a fun house for kids, filled with candy, toys, games, and he would often shower them with gifts. He even took Katie's brother on a trip to Disney World. Unchaperoned children congregated there with him daily, and no one seemed to bat an eye. There was also the godmother's husband, Sal. Katie lived with all of them, her biological mom and grandmother, Sal, and the godmother, Linda, all together in West Islip because money was so tight. And I also learned that Sal was facing child sex abuse charges related to the now missing Katie. There was truly no shortage of people in this circus-like cast of characters. It was like an unsavory game of Clue. Everyone appeared to have a motive to kidnap or harm the now missing Katie. I also began learning that Katie's young life, and you didn't have to be an investigative reporter to see, she had fallen through so many cracks, it was hard to fathom. And there's Katie right in the middle, smiling. She rarely went to school. When she did, she was sent home for repeated cases of head lice, inappropriate clothing for the weather, no shoes, no coat in the winter, dirty knots in her hair. There were laundromat workers I spoke with who often saw Katie for a number of years, they told me, now mind you, she's only 9 years old, doing the household laundry and all of the shopping chores, getting them breakfast and pizza, and with hardcore instructions. If she somehow failed to follow, she would appear in the subsequent days with bruises, and she had no friends of her own. She was 5, 6 years old, drinking coffee, shopping for the family's cigarettes, candy, and soda. Known to the whole strip mall in West Islip as the unkempt girl with yellow teeth nicknamed Dirty Katie. I spoke with one neighbor who admitted that Katie once meekly hinted that she was being touched in a sexual way by Sal. The woman said, of course, she couldn't go to police or the courts. She had her own legal problems, and she assumed that schools were doing something about it. I learned that CPS had been to Katie's house at least twice, and in one visit, the godmother, Linda, quote, chased the caseworker out. Astonishingly, Katie continued to live in the same house where the reported alleged neglect and abuse was taking place. Her mother was working 2 jobs as a cab driver. She was the only one earning a living, but was too busy to notice what seemed apparent to everyone else, that Katie was a profoundly abused and neglected child. As I wrote in the book, Buried Memories with Katie, 20 years after her rescue, for a dog, someone would have called the pound. For Katie, no one seemed to know what to do. The utter lack of response to what was seemingly an obviously neglected child was mind-boggling. It was as if an entire community had witnessed a hit and run, turned its collective head, and kept driving. After 7 days of a frantic, multi-state search for missing Katie Beers, Big John could keep it in no longer. He knew where Katie was, and she was alive. And he went to his lawyer, who called the media, then went to police. For those who may not be familiar with the story, all the details, I'll show you the photos. It's truly stunning, the extent that Big John went, John Esposito, to keep Katie hidden in plain sight. He had built an underground vault that would never have been found had little Katie not convinced him to give himself up. He had built it underground behind his Bayshore house, accessible only by a very complicated series of actions. A bookcase had to be pulled out from the wall on wheels. Then behind that bookcase, in a closet, if you knew to roll up the carpet, you would find a 200-pound cement slab that could only be moved with a special crank contraption. And then that exposed an underground narrow tunnel to a soundproof chamber the size of a small closet, 6 by 6, with a smaller coffin-sized box within it. And if you look at the picture, I'm talking about the box to the left. That's where Katie was hidden for 17 days, chained by her neck and hands. Here, she was kept isolated, cold, in darkness. Her only human interaction was with a flickering TV and Big John, who would come down to feed her, tell her he would keep her there for the rest of her life, marry her, have children with her, and every day sexually molest and rape her. In writing the book, I was given access to never before and never again heard tapes that he made in the dungeon, audio tapes. Big John was actually recording Katie in captivity. It is truly gut-wrenching to hear her soulful cries for help, someone to please let her out. But I also got a rare glimpse into the twisted mind of a pedophile. His conversations with Katie are all recorded. He was at once predator and, in his mind, trying to be her protector. And little Katie outwitted him and saved her own life. We would later learn that he built this dungeon, this torture bunker, specifically for Katie, to rescue her, he said, from her sad home life. In full view of neighbors, even Katie later remembered that she saw him build it. When Katie was found alive, it was not exactly the moment you would expect, of great relief for her, of an immediate rushing away from her evil captor. She will talk more about that, but for now, suffice it to say, there was a lack of understanding back in 1992 of some of the things that we take for granted today about the impact of sex abuse on child victims. There was, of course, great public curiosity about what condition Katie could possibly be in. The public had been rooting for her throughout her disappearance. She had become America's sweetheart. All were rooting for her to be alive and well. But James Catterson, the Suffolk DA at the time, made an impassioned plea: give Katie a chance. A plea to journalists like me to essentially stand down. Let Katie, now removed from her mother and her godmother, let her live out her childhood in anonymity and peace. And that's exactly what happened. Fast forward 20 years. I did the math. Katie would be all grown up. The story of how we connected is in our book, Buried Memories. But what I discovered upon finally meeting her is that resilience and recovery from the worst conceivable upbringing is possible, and that people who are in the position to intervene and facilitate change can truly work miracles. In collaborating with Katie on the book, I learned that CPS had been to Katie's house on multiple occasions. She was asked questions. She was so afraid of Sal, who was sexually abusing her from the age at least of 3, she lied, and there was no follow-up. Katie, I would learn, was subjected to far more sexual abuse than any of us could have imagined before the kidnapping. Red flags were waving all around her. And in a new setting, placed now with a loving East End foster family and a slew of new siblings, some of them also foster children. For the first time in her life, she was able to sit with a family for dinner. She was provided a toothbrush, a comfortable bed, rules and ethics and values, a framework for a far, far better life. Her new community included skilled and a loving therapist who specialized in child abuse, and caring protective teachers and caseworkers, and this photo doesn't begin to include all of them. There was a whole team behind Katie, a whole community, and as Katie flourished in this much-needed anonymity, her astounding story inspired much-needed change. The Suffolk Child Advocacy Center opened in 1997. It was a revolutionary concept at the time to spare children like her having to repeat details of their ordeal over and over and over again, as she had to investigators in frightening locations, in police stations, in the hospital, even feet away from her abuser and abductor. Hearings and a grand jury report would find fault with CPS at the time for having lax monitoring, shoddy record keeping, poorly trained caseworkers, police, and the DAs were not even sharing information on sex abuse cases at the time. Better collaboration and documentation was implemented. Katie would fade away from the headlines, but she left behind a legacy that would mean the children who came after her would have a better chance. Fast forward again to 2020. I would find myself covering another house of horrors. This time it was a little Suffolk County boy, and in this case it was too late. 8-year-old Tommy Valva, who had autism, was dead, frozen in his family's unheated garage, forced to sleep there as punishment for bedwetting. His very name causes us all to lower our heads in sorrow. I know no one in this room needs me to repeat the shameful details of this travesty. But yet, all of the same unthinkable questions came flooding back to me. Years of complaints, who knew what and when? With all of the state's now mandated reporting rules, how could another child fall through the cracks? Thomas's teachers had filed 11 reports with the state. He and his brother often came to school bruised, dirty, hungry, soaked in urine. Thomas told the teacher he was sleeping in the garage. He ate food out of the trash, crumbs from the floor. Another thick, grand jury report, and months ago, another 20 recommendations for change. So is everything now fixed? Well, I'm no expert. My only skill is in eliciting responses from those with the power to make change. But what I'm told by those closest to the system of reporting suspected abuse is that there is still a long way to go. But now, there is truly determination to make a difference like I have never seen before. Are caseloads lower? Well, not enough. The goal is 12. At this writing, there are caseworkers, maybe even in this room, with more than 15 and a handful with more than 20. Are the people who are needed to tackle this extraordinarily important and difficult life-saving job motivated and appreciated and paid appropriately? The county has brought in outside consultants to review salaries, raise salaries, and hire more caseworkers. Is there transparency? Can journalists like me follow up on unfounded abuse reports to know specifically what went wrong in a case like Tommy Valva? No. I'm pretty good at reporting on problems and the ensuing tragedies, but finding solutions is much, much harder. But this truly is a huge start. We're here together at one conference, laser focused on this issue, spearheaded by a county executive and county leaders who are genuinely motivated to make a difference, to heal from the Valva trauma and plot a course correction so that stories like end, more stories, more of these tragedies end like Katie Beers did. Katie went on to a small liberal arts college and earned a bachelor's degree in business management and accounting. There, she met a man. There she met a man she would fall in love with and marry. She and husband Derek have 2 children. This is quite old. They are now 15 and 13. And Katie is busy as a working mom with a career in insurance, and she shares her story often to inspire people to know that change is possible. People are not defined by the sometimes horrific circumstances they were born into. Abuse and neglect replaced with caring and community can rewrite an entire life. Katie's story that began with so much ugliness and pain has evolved into a beautifully uplifting one. Katie's strength, her spirit, her heart have taught me and countless others about resilience, and that action by the right people at the right time can truly turn a child's life around. Every child deserves the second chance that Katie got. Every child deserves a shot at a happy ending. What you in this child protective community do is a calling, and it is life-saving. So yes, the story of Katie Beers is both the worst and the best story I have ever covered, and it is also my favorite. I am proud to introduce my friend and hero, Katie Beers.
Thank you all so much for coming, for holding this conference. Literally got teary-eyed up here on my own story, because hearing about my own childhood doesn't faze me anymore because I lived it. But looking at the recovery, the life that I'm able to have now, that is what always gets me, thinking about my children, my husband, the fact that I was able to move on and have a seemingly normal life. Obviously, my childhood did not start off that way, as Carolyn explained. So as a child, I had Child Protective Services in my house quite a few times. I would go to school unkempt, visible bruises on me, not able to speak about what was going on, because also in school, they didn't teach about the horrors that could happen behind closed doors. So for somebody like me, I didn't know that it was okay for me to say these things. I had a perpetrator in my house that was telling me that I could not speak of these things. So when Child Protective Services eventually would come and interview me, they would interview me in the bedroom where the abuse was actually occurring. I would be sitting on the bed where the abuse was occurring because the caseworkers thought that that was a comfortable place for me to be, sitting on the bed in this room. Obviously, that was not the case, and in my head, I had the perpetrator telling me that I'm not allowed to tell anybody about what's going on, that I'm not allowed to share these things. So I wouldn't share these things. I would say that everything was okay. And behind closed doors, I was enduring physical, verbal, sexual abuse every day. So now, as an adult, looking back on my childhood, I know that there have been movements made. There are child advocacy centers all over the state and the country that have come about after my case, so that way children have a safe place to discuss what's going on. They're taken out of the situation. They feel more comfortable about talking about what's going on. A lot of times people want to, in my case, they want to fault Child Protective Services completely on my case and for me falling through the cracks. I have never felt that way because I was not truthful with my story. I was not able to share or speak about the things that were going on because I did not know that that was okay. So I've always said that it starts with education in the school system. It starts with teaching children that it's okay to talk about these things, that you need to be able to feel comfortable sharing these stories with whomever it is that you're comfortable with, whether it's a friend's parent, a teacher, somebody in the school district. For me, I didn't really feel comfortable sharing those things. I didn't feel comfortable in the situations that I was in where I should have been comfortable sharing my story. Now, out of my story, my terrible childhood, I was able to come out on the other side of things. And I will 100% credit that to my foster parents. My foster parents who were screened through Children Protective Services. They were chosen for me. I went in and lived with them when I was 10 years old, and it's the household that I should have had from the beginning. I like my story because I'm able to share the horrors of what I grew up with, what I went through. I can talk for a long time about the system and the people that have failed me, but that's not the point of my story. The point of my story is that when I was able to get help, that I was able to start therapy, live in a household with 2 wonderful parents. I had siblings. I had people that I felt safe with. I was in an environment that I felt safe in. And I was able ultimately to recover and turn my story around because of those things. If it wasn't for the foster family and the therapy that I had gone through, my upbringing and where I'm at now would be completely different. I know that we're here to talk about the Child Protective Service system and social services and the revamps that need to be made. Obviously, as times change, as you're presented with social media and all of these other things that children now have access to that I didn't have access to, obviously things do need to change. There are a lot of things that can be done, and I think first and foremost is educating children that they are okay to share these things and share anything that they're uncomfortable with their teachers, with anybody. Sorry, I'm still getting emotional. But the Child Protective Services, they ultimately, for me, ended up being my hero after I was abducted and found. I always say that the best thing that happened to me was being abducted. And the reason being is because then it was truly brought to light about what was going on behind the closed doors of my house. If it wasn't for the abduction, then I would not have gotten the help that I so greatly needed. I think that I probably would have continued to move on with my life, with not sharing my story, with not telling about the horrors that were going on behind closed doors. I think we're gonna do a Q&A. That is always my favorite part of talking, because I could talk to you guys about my entire upbringing. But you guys are here, I think, to learn and to ask questions and to figure out things that will help to change or make the system better. So I think if it's okay, that we'll move on to that portion. Yep.
Yep, this is on. Thank you, Katie. And I think we probably need tissues back here as well. So you are not alone in that, myself included. So there's going to be two of us. We're going to run up the aisle. If you have a question, please just raise your hand and we'll come to you. We think that'll make that easier. So if anyone has a question for Katie and Carolyn. I saw this one first.
First, thank you for being here and sharing your story for all of us. So for me, I believe your story is one of just incredible human resilience. Was there a moment that you can recall where you went, aha, I'm okay? And what was that moment like for you, and how can we replicate that for other kids to create that environment?
I was probably, honestly, a teenager before I had my aha moment that I'm safe. Now, I was safe with my foster family, but I was still going through the trial of Sal Angaleri, who was sexually abusing me or had sexually abused me. I was still going through preparing at the DA's office for the trial against John Esposito, who had abducted me. My biological mother was still trying to gain custody of me. And I think, honestly, that might have been the thing that scared me the most, was going back into a household with my biological mother, because I didn't know prior to going into foster care what a home was supposed to feel like. I didn't know that there was neglect going on. So I think when somebody finally explained to me that, yes, she's trying to get you back, but it's very highly likely that that's not going to happen, that's when I think I had my point where I was able to breathe and able to move on with my childhood.
Other questions?
Diana, we have a question over here. Stand up.
Thank you again for sharing your story. It requires so much courage, which you need to be commended for, both of you.
Thank you.
My question is, now that you are an adult, what strategies do you use? And I don't mean to make it sound so clinical, but it could be informal things for self-care, to be able to sometimes when those memories may come back, how you're able to stay present and grateful, but also deal with the triggers to move forward into a more positive adult life.
I would have to say that my husband helped greatly with helping me deal with my triggers and dealing with the uncertainties. I mean, it's definitely not easy for anybody to be friends with or in a relationship with somebody that's gone through all of these traumas. Thank God again for the therapy that I went through, for my foster parents, for them letting me know that I'm in a safe environment. There are still some triggers that I'll have every now and again. They fortunately have gotten less and less over time. And I've just learned to just separate myself from the position that I'm in, from the circumstances that I'm in, and just take a minute for myself so I can just breathe. Thankfully, I've learned coping skills and mechanisms to deal with that through therapy. So I'm self-aware of the self-care aspect of dealing with it.
Any questions on this side? I don't want to miss hands.
I think we have a question back here.
Hi, thank you for being here. Could you clarify the duration of therapy and the type of therapy you received over the years and how early it was before you started that?
So I went immediately into therapy, probably like the second week of being in foster care. It was very important for that to start immediately. The first therapist that I saw was a child therapist. And while she was fantastic, I wasn't dealing with childhood problems. I wasn't dealing with normal childhood trauma. So my foster parents pretty quickly changed gears and found a different therapist that was still in our town of East Hampton, who was more capable of dealing with a child that had been through such severe sexual abuse and the other traumas that I endured. She stood by me through the trial against Sal Angaleri. She was with me a lot of times when I was talking with the district attorney dealing with the case against John Esposito. And I actually continued to see her until I was 18. I still now have a very close relationship with her. So I talk to her on a regular basis as well.
But I also could add that at first, Katie's therapy was geared towards the fact that you were being prepared to testify.
Yes.
That was initially, as the prosecutor nods in the third row, Bill was very close to this case. I mean, so the purpose, I believe, if I'm correct, is that Katie was being prepared for being a witness against both Sal Angaleri and the kidnapper, John Esposito. And then it ended up being something that even after Katie bravely testified, and I'll never forget on the cover of the New York Post was the courage of Katie when she took the stand. This little waif, stood up to Sal Angaleri and stared him down and told a courtroom and a judge what he did. And after that, Mary Bromley, the therapist, who's still in practice in East Hampton, used all sorts of techniques like art to help Katie deal with her trauma. And also what was very pivotal, I don't even know if you remember, but she brought a man, another victim, who had been also oddly buried alive in an underground tomb for a number of days and survived, obviously. And he came and spoke with Katie in therapy, and they had so much in common, and they bonded, and I think that was also, do you remember that?
Harvey, absolutely.
Harvey.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think that in therapy, they really used all sorts of techniques throughout her childhood, and then it became more mundane teenage things. But, you know, very early on, there was this very mindful approach to, you know, helping Katie, A, survive her ordeal, but B, survive being put on the stand to face her accusers.
I actually
To face her abusers, excuse me, abusers.
Harvey actually, through my therapy sessions with him, Harvey Weinstein, who has passed away, I want to say maybe a decade ago, it was actually through one of the therapy sessions with him that I had realized that I had actually played in the underground bunker when it was being built. When it was just a hole in the ground, my brother and I were literally like jumping in there and jumping out and just playing in it when I was 8 years old. So I had that memory when I was dealing with Harvey. And I actually met his son maybe like 8 years ago in LA. So that was a neat experience.
Yeah, but
too.
meeting somebody else who had been through a similar trauma, even though he was, you know, decades older than her, was very helpful, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I think we helped each other a lot.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for honoring us with your story. It's a more personal question, but as a mother of a survivor and being a survivor, how did you approach the subject with your sons about surviving sexual trauma? Like, how did you, like, what age was it that you began to provide that psychoeducation to them without projecting your own fears onto them as well?
So we started writing Buried Memories. The one picture Carolyn shared, I was actually very newly pregnant with my son, Logan, who's now 15. We started traveling or doing media for the book when Logan was 4, and Haley was 2.
had just been born, I think, yeah.
So they were very, very young. So fortunately, they, part of their childhood was mom going away for a couple of days and working, whether it be for media or doing speeches and things like that. So it wasn't necessary for me to explain things to them too early, so I was able to do it on my own time. Logan was maybe around 7 or 8 when I had told him that I was abducted. And I started with the very broad explanation of what happened to me. Obviously didn't go into anything in detail, but just I started as their ages were appropriate. He's more intrigued with my story than my daughter is. So I share with him when he has questions. I'm always very open with him. I want him to ask questions because it's also a learning experience for him about what happened to me and about the horrors that there are out there. One of the things that I've tried really hard not to be is a helicopter parent. And I think with anybody, that's very, very difficult. So I've always kept my children very close and have been very guarded with who they're around.
When, Katie, did you have a discussion about their body being, you know, their own domain and for no one else, you know, without their consent?
We started broaching those topics with them when they were very young. Just obviously, just here and there, just making sure that they knew that if anything ever, God forbid, happened or they felt uncomfortable, that we wanted to make sure in any situation that they felt comfortable talking to us. Even if it was a situation where they didn't want somebody driving them home because they felt uncomfortable in the car, I wanted them to know that they were able to come to us and tell us these things. So we started when they were really young, just so they would know that we are a safe space for them.
We have a question up here in the mezzanine.
So first of all, Carolyn, thank you for bringing the story, and that you can be here to share this story 32 years after you covered it initially. But particularly Katie, thank you for your courage, your strength, and teaching us. My question, since in this audience there are people who really do believe that reunification is the hallmark. And as a child psychiatrist, I've worked with many children for whom I've advocated termination of parental rights, often at odds with social services and the courts. So given how powerful that anxiety was when you were worried that you might be returned to your mom, could you tell us how important it was that parental rights were terminated and you were allowed to remain with your foster parents?
That I actually do not think that Marilyn's parental rights were ever terminated. I think she, if I remember correctly, I think she fought to regain custody of me until I was 18. And then at that point in time, I still continued to live with my foster family. But in my case, absolutely, her parental rights should have been taken away, probably pretty early on. Because it was, as a child, it was stressful for me knowing that she was going to court to try to get custody back of me. And so that would always be a point of a lot of anxiety for me growing up, even as a later teenager. While I think in a lot of cases, family reunification is appropriate and great, in my situation, it was not. I have said in my adult life now, realizing that Marilyn did neglect me horribly as a child, and that's what led to a lot of the instances of abuse or the capability of that happening. She should have really never had custody of myself or my biological half-brother. There were a lot of red flags with him as well. He didn't go to school a lot. I think he dropped out of school when he was 16, and that was acceptable at that point in time because she signed off on it. But in situations that I grew up in with the neglect and the abuse in the household, and her not taking me out of the household where she knew the abuse was occurring, it should have never been on the table.
And interestingly, you continued, and to this day, continue to have contact with her, or not recently? I know you continued through your teenage years having visits, and you were never really thrilled about those, but you did it.
When I was probably 15 or 16 and started getting involved in sports, visitation dwindled down drastically. When I was then 18, I was allowed to see her whenever I wanted, which was not very often. I've been with my husband for 20 years, and she's met him a handful of times. She has not met my 13-year-old daughter. She's met my son once when he was 18 months old. I have finally chosen for myself to not have a relationship with her and not try to have a relationship with her, because I've just finally realized that it was very toxic. Giving up that relationship with her, I also gave up a relationship with my biological brother, who I also have not seen in or talked to in probably 7 or 8 years.
It's on. Yep, it just takes a, okay. Hello. I really find you very powerful and fantastic person, and I really appreciate hearing your story.
Thank you.
I work with many, many women who've had significant histories, and I work with them and their children. And it comes from my perspective, my question, which has to do with, there's an article called Ghosts in the Nursery, which is all about when there's a parent who has a very challenging childhood of abuse and neglect, that when you then have children, that it can reemerge and be very much present in the nursery with you. And I actually find that that is something that not just a parent with a neglectful and abusive background, but as a parent myself, I find that. So I'm just wondering, when you became a parent, did you find that that actually did occur? And if so, what kind of support were you able to get to address those kinds of re-traumatizing of these past experiences?
Part of my recovery was being able to distance myself with my childhood. So while I talk about my childhood, and it is present with me every day, the abuses that I went through and everything else, I, through being able to go through therapy, have chosen to not have that be forefront on my mind. Now, of course, I went through it when my daughter was about 2 years old. I had a memory that that's about when my abuse had started, when I had started being sexually abused. And so her being 2 years old was a little rough and triggering for me for a little bit. Fortunately, my husband is he's a very big presence and knows, obviously, all about my childhood. So he was able to help me navigate those things while I wasn't going to therapy any longer. At that point, I at least had him to talk to and rely on heavily.
Good afternoon, Katie and Carolyn. Thank you so much for sharing decades later the story. One of the things I picked up on is you indicated that when you were interviewed, and you were interviewed in a horrific environment where the abuse was occurring, looking back and putting yourself back to that time, do you think there was anything that caseworkers might have been able to do that you may be able to suggest to try to get to the truth when it appears to me you were horrifically in a circumstance? Was it fear? Was it anything that you think that might have been able to make a difference that you might be able to suggest today? Thank you.
I strongly think that if I was taken out of the household where the abuse was occurring and interviewed, talked to in a different location, or even not the bedroom where it was occurring, I think that I would have been able to be a little bit more forthcoming. And I do know that with the child advocacy centers, they are now doing that. They're taking the kids out of the households, bringing them to a place that's geared toward children so they feel more safe in sharing their stories. My situation was just one of those anomalies that it was the perfect storm for me not feeling comfortable sharing what was going on. The caseworker, I think, truly thought that they were doing the best thing by bringing me into a secure room where nobody else was so they could interview me with nobody being able to overhear and things like that. They just chose, unfortunately, in that house, the very particular wrong room.
I mean, it's a real conundrum, because if you're being abused and terrified by this, really frightening person, and he was a big, frightening man, I don't know what the strategies are to getting the truth from a child, but clearly Katie did not feel safe revealing it to anyone at the time. And then the one time she did utter it to a neighbor, the neighbor washed their hands of it. And I also alluded in my talk to a second time that Katie was, felt very uncomfortable. If you want to just talk briefly, Katie, about when you were ultimately rescued, in the moments later, you were placed also in a situation which you look back and kind of shake your head.
So After John Esposito had told the police that he had me, police came to the house and were recovering me. One of the things that I had done with John to try to get him to think about what he was doing, to try to get him to release me, to, I don't know, try to manipulate him in some way, was trying to ask him, well, what's going to happen when I'm older? I want to go to school. I want to graduate college. I want to get a job. I want to have children. And he always had answers to those. I wouldn't have to work because he would have enough money. I would marry him. I would have children with him. So the day that of the rescue, the police came down into the dungeon, and it was just, I believe, 2 male officers, if I remember correctly. And I had this terrible, fearful moment that maybe John was trying to manipulate me in some way, that maybe these people were here to abuse me in some capacity. It took me a minute to realize that I was safe, or that I felt like I was safe. The door to the dungeon was open. I realized it was open. I hightailed it out of there. Then there was a man up at the top that was helping me out. So in this situation, it was all a lot of men. I think there was one woman present on this day, at least that I recall. But while they were waiting for the police car to get into the driveway to come take me out, they sat me in the room with John Esposito. I was probably this close to him, and I was actually, I don't recall this, but I was told that I actually took an opportunity to go over to him and talk to him and tell him that it was going to be okay. I don't recall that. I do recall being in the room with him and sitting very close with him for what seemed like ever.
Right. Yeah. So I think, there's a lot of moments that we can all learn from Katie's story.
Hi. I had, sorry. Go ahead. Oh, okay. From a legal point of view, and I'm a lawyer, so I think of things meanly and cold-heartedly, but do you feel that going to trial, especially as a child, was that a cathartic thing? Was it, obviously it was difficult, but could you talk a little bit about what you felt the legal system either brought or took away from for you?
So I only had to testify against Sal Angaleri, fortunately. I still had to share my story and what happened with John Esposito, which I actually did not share all of that after being found. It wasn't until his parole hearing in 2006 that I shared some additional information. But honestly, the district attorney's office, when we were doing the interviews with them and preparing for the court, they made it as pleasant of an experience as they could have, given the topics that we were discussing. So I never felt unsafe or like I had to share on any given day with them. I think there were days that I had gone into the DA's office and I just didn't talk. I think I colored in the district attorney's office. I remember he brought me out for ice cream one day because I just didn't want to talk. And they made it comforting in a way. They weren't, while they had a job to do, they had to get things done. They also weren't pressuring me to talk about more than what I felt comfortable talking about. So for me, that was, I would say, absolutely helpful.
And I feel that everything in the case was really geared for Katie's future, not to make it any worse for Katie. I think that there was an attempt to get Sal to plead guilty so that it would spare Katie having to testify, even though it would have meant a relatively short sentence for him. In the case of John Esposito, he did plead guilty, and that was all to spare Katie. So, I mean, as an adult, in hindsight, you know, they probably didn't serve, although John Esposito ended up dying in prison after finally confessing to sexually abusing Katie on the very day that he finally admitted that. He was later found dead. But all of it was to protect Katie, and you know, clearly we see the results. So, you know, there was a trade-off there. I think that most prosecutors in the case, and certainly the district attorney at the time, would agree, you know, that the goal was to spare you any more trauma.
Absolutely.
Right. Carolyn, thank you so much for being here and for helping to share Katie's story with such compassion. We do appreciate that. Katie, thank you so much for your bravery. We appreciate that as well.
Thank you.
My question to you is this: we have such a shortage of foster parents here in Suffolk County. You talk with such kindness and love about your foster parents. What would you say to a couple or anybody in Suffolk County who was thinking about becoming a foster parent?
That's a good question. I definitely think that it takes a special couple or special person to become a foster parent. I will tell you, I absolutely put my foster parents through hell in my teenage years. I'm not going to deny that. But they were fantastic and never wavered. But my foster parents had a couple children before me. One of them they ultimately adopted, and then I was their last one and probably their most stressful. But they just had this love and compassion that they wanted to share, and they knew that they needed to share it. I definitely think that it takes just a special person. I don't think that anybody or everybody could be a foster parent, and there are a lot of people that shouldn't be capable of being a foster parent. I've heard stories from people that I know directly that have been in the foster care system where they've had horrible experiences, possibly worse experiences in the foster homes than they did in their biological homes that they were coming from. So I definitely, there needs to be, I think, more training and more resources for the parents and the families that the foster children are going into.
Okay, so we don't have any time for questions, but what we wanted to do in front of everyone is, Bill, I'm sorry to do this to you, but we wanted to reunite the prosecutor who put away Katie's, and he's been emotional all day, and this is just something that really needs to happen.
That's so nice.
I'll carry your books.
That's wonderful.
I turned it away.
Katie was my first experience with CPS, and as emotional it was for Katie, it was emotional as I think back in the DA's office. We spent night and day looking for Katie and applying pressure where we could, John Esposito, Larry, to try to make someone talk. And I will mention the attorney that I spoke to who finally revealed where Katie was. And actually was done in a judge's chambers. And I called right away, called Jim Catterson, and the police got there right away. I still feel very emotional at times on this myself. And Katie's success story, a lot of people helping, her foster parents, her therapist, the people in the community, and Katie herself, her resilience. Congratulations, Katie.
Thank you.
Mm.
So good to see you.
I will see you after this.
Thank you so much, Katie, for coming and being so brave and telling your story, and Carolyn for helping to bring this story for all of us. I hope that we all can learn some things from this and make sure that we take this as we move forward. It's just been really very wonderful to have you speak and for us to be able to learn from. I don't think that we have any more time for any questions, but there was one that came in from the app about education, and if there was anything else that the schools could have done to have made it easier for you to come and speak to somebody. And that came through on the app, and I just was wondering if there was something that you could think about.
There have been, I don't want to say advancements, but there have been changes to the educational curriculums and the way that abuse is presented in schools. Back in the 80s, that's when this happened to me, my God. But back then, people just didn't want to get involved. Whether it be in the schools or your community, people just didn't want to involve themselves in something that didn't personally directly affect them, that it wasn't happening within their own four walls. But now I do believe that with schools, education system, and even like silly little cartoons that kids watch, everything talks now about finding somebody that you're comfortable with, finding an adult that you're comfortable with, a teacher, whomever it might be. So I think that now, if I would look back, if I would bring my childhood to present age, I probably would have felt more comfortable talking to somebody a lot sooner, or even just going directly to somebody without being prompted and talking to them about what was going on.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.